In November 1971, a man hijacked an airplane, extorted $200,000 in ransom, and parachuted out of the plane never to be seen again. This began a 45-year-long FBI investigation and remains the only unsolved piracy case in commercial aviation history. Today, we explore the strangeness of D.B. Cooper. Welcome back to another episode of Down with the Strangeness. I am your host, Ben, and this is the podcast where each and every week we dive into another piece of strangeness from this crazy world. I want to thank everybody who listened, downloaded, subscribed, and followed after last week's episode on Lake City Quiet Pills. And thank you to anyone who may be listening for the very first time. If you didn't listen to last week's episode, I kicked this whole show or this series off. This podcast began with an episode on one of my favorite stories, Lake City Quiet Pills. So definitely go back and give that a listen if you haven't already. And while last week's story took place in more of the modern era, right? Modern times, 2009, 2010. This week, we're going to take it back to 1971 for a classic piece of strangeness. One of the more mainstream type of things we're probably going to cover on this podcast. The only unsolved piracy case in commercial aviation history, the strange story of D.B. Cooper. So let's get into it. On November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a man using the name Dan Cooper used cash to purchase a one-way ticket on Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 from Portland to Seattle. Cooper was described as a quiet man in his mid-40s wearing a business suit with a black tie and white shirt as well as brown dress shoes. He spoke intelligently and he had no obvious accent. He was carrying with him a black briefcase, not super uncommon for a business-looking man flying, especially at the time. I would imagine. I don't know the exact years that the show took place, but when I picture these D.B. Cooper scenes in my head, it looks a lot like the show Mad Men. So it also appeared that Cooper had a brown paper bag with him, like the kind of bag you would have used to pack lunch for school or to take on a field trip. And before we go any further, please keep in mind that airport security in 1971, and really any time before September 11th, 2001, was a much different beast, a different animal than it is today, especially when you take it all the way back to 1971 when this whole thing went down. So if you're questioning certain things about security, the investigation tactics, or even just the behavior of the people, just keep in mind or remember the time that we're talking about. So anyway, we have Dan Cooper leaving Portland for Seattle, dressed in standard issue businessman attire, traveling with a briefcase and a brown paper bag. He sat in the rear of the plane, or at least near the rear of the plane. Seat 18C seems to be the popular and I guess most likely place that he sat. But there were a couple other seat numbers that I saw as I was researching this episode. Ultimately, it's kind of irrelevant. All that matters is that he was definitely in the rear of the airplane, probably in the last row of seats. The plane had 36 passengers plus the crew. We had pilot Captain William Scott, First Officer Bob Radicek, Flight Engineer H.E. Anderson, and flight attendants Tina Mucklow and Florence Schaffner. Cooper ordered a bourbon and soda and proceeded to light a cigarette while waiting for takeoff. And shortly after the plane was in the air, he handed a note to the flight attendant Schaffner. It wasn't uncommon for men of the time to give flight attendants notes containing phone numbers, hotel room numbers, and other, call it aggressive pickup attempts. So Schaffner really didn't give it much of a thought. She put it in her pocket, and she just kind of went on with her duties without ever opening or reading the note. But the next time that she walked near his seat, Cooper said, "Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb," as he nodded towards his black briefcase. Schaffner read the note, which again mentioned the bomb, and it also indicated that Cooper wanted her to sit with him. Now, again, based on my research, and I'm no expert when it comes to really anything, but based on the research that I was doing for this episode, which took a lot longer than I anticipated, it seems that there isn't really a clear picture of how the next few moments played out, at least not as definitive as some of the other details in this story. One report that I read claimed that Schaffner read the note in the galley of the plane. She informed Mucklow, the other flight attendant, of the situation, then notified the pilots before ever sitting with Cooper. Other reports claim that she read the note, as we talked about, and then immediately sat beside him. And even within the versions where she immediately sits beside him, there's variance with those reports as well, with one of the stories saying Schaffner dropped the note and kind of secretly signaled to Mucklow to pick it up, and another making it seem as though Mucklow found out at the same time as the pilots. Regardless of exactly how everybody found out, the main sequence of events and the rest of the story is still largely the same. So Cooper gets Florence Schaffner to read the note. She sits beside him, and he opens his briefcase. He shows her red sticks connected to red wires and a large battery. Considering that most people probably don't know shit about bombs outside of what we see in movies, I would say that that was convincing enough to be taken serious, especially on an airplane. So Cooper takes back the original note that he had given to Schaffner, likely to avoid leaving it behind as evidence, and he begins to communicate to Schaffner his demands. And he has her write these down and relay them to Captain William Scott, the pilot. Cooper demands, and some of this is going to be quoted for a specific reason, but we're going to go through it. Cooper demands $200,000 in negotiable American currency, made up of $20 bills with non-sequential serial numbers. So that is very specific. And if $200,000 doesn't sound like a lot of money, that's probably because you're listening to this in 2021. And this occurred 50 years ago, almost. And after running the numbers in an online inflation calculator, it looks like $200,000 in 1971 would be the equivalent of a little over $1.3 million today. So this is a pretty big heist relative to the times. In addition to the $200,000, Cooper also demanded 4 parachutes, 2 back parachutes and 2 front parachutes. And he also wanted a fuel truck waiting for them when the plane landed in Seattle so that it could refuel. Everyone involved kind of remembers this chilling and albeit somewhat cheesy line from Cooper that said, quote, "No funny stuff or I'll do the job." And we can assume that that means detonate the bomb. Before we keep going, something that was really interesting to me was that everyone who interacted with Cooper, primarily the flight attendants, but they agree that he was not nervous at all. Schaffner described him as calm, polite, and well-spoken. Mucklow told investigators that he wasn't nervous. He seemed rather nice. He was never cruel or nasty. He was thoughtful and calm all the time. Cooper even ordered a second bourbon and soda. He actually paid his drink tab, and he even offered to add meals for the flight crew to his list of demands for when they arrived in Seattle. And that is, all of that is just kind of, they're interesting tidbits that really help build the legend of DB Cooper. And this is kind of what paints him as more of an anti-hero than a villain, which is why I think that we look at him in a higher regard, or at least with more affection than we look at other historical criminals, like popular serial killers, right? Because no one was hurt in a way in any of this, at least so far, right? So that it really paints him as a hero, like the outlaws of the Old West, that same kind of view or mentality. Something else that Mucklow mentioned about her interactions with Cooper was that he seemed to be pretty familiar with the area, making accurate references to their location relative to both Tacoma, Washington, and McChord Air Force Base. So with Cooper's demands communicated to Captain William Scott, the captain contacts Seattle-Tacoma Airport Air Traffic Control, who then informs local and federal authorities of the situation and the demands. Northwest Orient's president, Donald Nyrup, he authorized the payment of the ransom in the amount, the $200,000, and he ordered all employees on board the aircraft to just comply with the demands of Cooper, the hijacker. And the money was the easy part. FBI agents quickly assembled 10,000 non-sequential $20 bills. The bills were unmarked, not sequential, as Cooper demanded, but the FBI is not stupid. They did make a microfilm photograph, which is essentially a somewhat reduced photocopy, but they made these copies of each bill to keep track of the serial number so that they could be traced later. But the money was the easy part. The parachutes were a little harder. Cooper refused the easy option that McChord Air Force Base had offered military-issued parachutes. But Cooper refused those, and he instead insisted that he wanted civilian, or I guess recreational, parachutes that would have manually operated ripcords, because these military parachutes, from what I can tell, would deploy differently, right? They did it themselves, whereas Cooper wanted something where he could make the decision on when the chute came out. Now, while authorities on the ground are working to meet the Cooper demands, another part of the strangeness that kind of adds a little extra wow to the legend of DB Cooper is that after successfully communicating his demand, Schaffner returns to the seat where Cooper's sitting to sit back next to him. And now he has moved over to the window seat, and he's wearing a pair of black sunglasses, which gives us the now iconic sketch of Cooper, or one of them, which those who listen/watch on YouTube will be seeing in the video component of this podcast. Now, the flight left Portland at 2:50 p.m., and from Portland to Seattle is supposed to be about a 30-minute flight. But the plane told passengers that they had a mechanical issue, a reason that they had to circle, and the plane circled around for over 2 hours before it finally landed at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Upon arrival, Cooper instructed Captain Scott to taxi to a remote yet well-lit area after they landed. Cooper had all the lights inside the cabin dimmed, in addition to shutting the window shades to prevent potential sniper intervention. Upon arrival, Northwest Orient's Seattle's operation manager, Al Lee, he met with Tina Mucklow at the rear of the stairs of the plane, which those stairs will come up again later, but that is where he gave her both the money and the parachutes, fulfilling Cooper's demands. And once Cooper got these things, he releases all the passengers and some of the crew members from the aircraft, leaving only Cooper himself, flight attendant Tina Mucklow, Captain William Scott, that's the pilot, co-pilot First Officer William Radicek, and flight engineer H.E. Anderson. While they're waiting to refuel, which took a little bit longer than it was supposed to because there was a mechanical problem with the first fuel truck, Cooper begins discussing his next steps with the remaining crew and with the pilot. And he ordered that the pilot would keep to an altitude, or remain at an altitude below 10,000 feet, and keep the speed below 150 knots, which I converted online to 172, 173 miles per hour. Cooper wanted the landing gear to be deployed the entire time, with the wing flaps of the plane lowered to 15 degrees. He wanted the cabin to remain unpressurized. One demand that Northwest Orient's home office refused to accommodate was that Cooper wanted to take off and remain in the air with those rear stairs and the rear exit open. But they, like I said, Northwest Orient refused to comply with this one demand, and Cooper decided to proceed with the rest of his plan anyway. He informed the crew and the pilots that he wanted to go to Mexico City. But the pilots explained to Cooper that this was not possible for the aircraft. Based on the specific instructions and conditions that Cooper had demanded, the aircraft would probably only be able to fly about 1,000 miles, even with fuel tanks at max capacity. Now, because of this, Cooper agrees to a refuel stop in Reno, Nevada. And at approximately 7:40 p.m., the plane takes off with only Cooper and the 4 remaining crew members on board, following all of Cooper's demands except for 2, leaving the rear flight stairs open and the flight path that Cooper had initially wanted to Mexico City. We already discussed the stairs being left open, but another thing that wasn't followed 100% to Cooper's wishes was the route the flight would take on its way to Reno, taking a more southern and less direct path than Cooper had initially anticipated. The plane was being followed by 2 military fighter planes from the McChord Air Force Base that we talked about earlier, and those fighter planes trailed behind Cooper's plane, having one stay above and one stay below, trying to stay slightly behind. Although it was difficult for the fighter planes to stay consistent with the flight, or with Flight 305, as they needed to go too fast to avoid stalling out at that very low speed that Cooper had required his aircraft to move. So there was likely some movement and variance and kind of cycling in and out that was happening there. Now, once Flight 305 is in the air, Cooper instructs Mucklow, who had been sitting with him this entire time and communicating out most of what Cooper was saying. He instructs her to join the rest of the crew in the plane's cabin, and she follows his instructions. But as she leaves, she notices Cooper tying something around his waist. She was not exactly sure what he was doing, and nobody really is exactly sure, but it's assumed that he was working to tie or secure the money for this next part. At around 8 p.m., a warning light begins flashing in the cockpit. And this specific light indicates that the mechanical component or the mechanism for the stairs, those rear stairs, that rear exit, has been activated. Now, co-pilot First Officer William Radicek, he uses the plane's intercom system to communicate with Cooper, asking him if he needs or wants assistance, but Cooper refuses. And that would be the final time that the crew, or anyone, as far as we know, would have any contact with Cooper. A little bit later, the crew notices a change in air pressure, indicating that the stairs or that rear exit are fully open now. And around 8:13 p.m., the tail of the aircraft experiences a sudden and sharp upward movement that required the pilots to course correct, right? They had to put effort in. And the way that I assume is that kind of you have cruise control set and you're going down the highway, right? And you come up on a slow car. Not only do you either have to break your cruise control to slow down, you have to turn to go around it, but you have to now address this. That's kind of in my brain, I guess, how I made that make sense. But they experienced this turbulence or disruption around 8:13 p.m. and then the plane lands in Reno, Nevada around 10:15 p.m., which is 2 hours later. Rear stairs open the entire time they're landing. Once the plane comes to a stop, FBI agents, along with state troopers, sheriff's deputies, and Reno police, surround the jet and conduct an armed search of the airplane. But Cooper, the money, and 2 of the parachutes were gone. Now, this investigation kicks off immediately. But the FBI did not have much to work with. Very little evidence coming into this. They found 66 unidentified fingerprints, as well as a black clip-on tie that we can assume was left by Cooper. There were 8 cigarette butts where he had been sitting, and the remaining 2 parachutes that he did not take with him when he presumably jumped. An interesting note here is of the 4 parachutes given to Cooper, 1 was what is called a dummy chute. It's essentially fake. It's sewn shut, and it's meant only for demonstration or practice. And they claim it was given to Cooper by mistake. There is part of me that assumes it was and there was an element of sabotage, perhaps. But if he had just taken 2 functional parachutes and paid a little more attention, he would have been fine, or it wouldn't have mattered. But either way, one of the 2 parachutes missing was the dummy chute, meaning that was one of the ones that Cooper took when he jumped. They also used a number of eyewitness testimonies to create the composite sketches of Cooper that are most famously now associated with the story. I think most of us have seen this sketch, whether you realize it or not. If you watched the Disney Plus series Loki, they spoofed on this DB Cooper case, claiming that Loki was in if you know that what Tom Hiddleston, the actor that plays Loki, he does have a striking resemblance to the sketch. YouTube listeners or watchers, I suppose, will be seeing the sketch on their screen now, so you guys can be the judge. But before we go any further into the investigation, one more reminder of the time that we're dealing with. It's 1971, so things like DNA and fingerprints don't hold the same kind of weight in usage as they do today. Now, at the same time, the authorities start getting to work. So is the media, right? So some things never change. Local reporter James Long, likely in a hurry to get this story done and be the first to kind of get on it, right? To get the insight, to be the one to break this story, and cover this now famous hijacking. He used, by mistake, the popular namesake of this story, DB Cooper, because if you remember back when we started this whole story, the man who purchased the ticket, he purchased that ticket under the name Dan Cooper, and there was never anything to really concretely connect. It was used in error. There were a couple accounts of how that happened, but again, irrelevant. The name DB Cooper was used in error in the first report, and with other media outlets jumping on this relatively quickly, that original name that was an accident just kind of stuck, and now that's why we're talking about DB Cooper. That's why this episode is called DB Cooper, even though the man's quote-unquote name is Dan Cooper. So while the FBI, they jumped onto some more obvious and or hopeful suspects, the investigation starts trying to get more information about what happens, find more evidence, anything that can kind of help them break this case open. And if we were to go into extreme detail or in depth of every aspect of the investigation, this episode would be far too long. You may even be able to make a separate podcast series just about this. I'm sure someone already has. But we're going to cover a more general timeline, an overview for the remainder of the investigation, hitting all the important bits and then circling back to some stuff later. So we'll go through the investigation. Then when we get to the theories, we can connect some of these things and talk a little more in depth about the things that matter. But the plane lands. Cooper and the money are gone. FBI confirms suspicion of the jump occurring at 8:13 when that movement or turbulence occurred, and the pilots had to address it. The FBI was able to recreate that same upward turbulence or movement that the pilots experienced by dropping a weight off the rear stairs of a test plane that was roughly equivalent to the weight of Cooper plus the money, right? There can be variance. It still demonstrates that him jumping is likely what caused that shift. And it gives them at least an idea or starting point for where to begin the ground search, right? Based on the time of the jump and some of the conditions that they know. So they begin a massive and probably one of the most intensive search and recovery missions in American history. Boots hit the ground. They had people on foot going door to door and searching the wilderness within the suspected jump or landing zone. They also used helicopters, patrol boats, and even a submarine searching for Cooper or at least any sign of him or further evidence of the jump. But initial search and really the investigation as a whole comes up relatively empty. Something that can be considered evidence in a way, but doesn't provide much in terms of a solve to the case. At least we get to some of the theories later on. There were 6 letters sent to several newspapers and media outlets in the months following the hijacking, all of them claiming to be from Cooper. Some of them typed, some of them handwritten, others done with the cut and paste of magazine and newspaper letters like movie ransom notes. Now these letters all claimed a wide variety of things, including the inaccuracy of the composite sketch, claiming that Cooper wore clay on his face, like modeling clay as a disguise, to things like Cooper was a man who only had months to live. A couple interesting things, though, about these letters is that at least one contained information that had not at the time been made public, raising the question how anyone would know this detail other than the real Dan or DB Cooper. And another thing is that the FBI didn't notify the public of the 5th and 6th letter until the 2000s, indicating that they had a reason to do that, right? To treat them differently, to not make them available. But ultimately, nothing very helpful came from these letters. Now, November 1978, nearly 7 years after the hijacking, they get the next piece of evidence. And again, it's not anything groundbreaking, but in a hunting cabin off of a logging road, a printout of instructions for how to lower the rear stairs of a Boeing 727 were discovered. The Boeing 727 is the exact plane that of Flight 305 that Cooper jumped out of. From the exact staircase that Cooper jumped out of. The cabin was in the flight path taken of the jump. And again, ultimately it didn't lead to much, but it's a strong piece of evidence that they're at least looking in generally the right area. And the next piece of evidence, and probably the biggest piece of concrete evidence of anything, and biggest, especially to this point, came in 1980, when 8-year-old Brian Ingram found 3 packets of the ransom cash on the riverbank of Tina Bar, which was conceivably within the parameters of the jump area when you look at waterways. The FBI confirmed that they matched the serial numbers of the money given to Cooper, even though the money had partially disintegrated from exposure. These bundles were still held together by the rubber bands, which in the conspiracy sense, I don't have too much of a note to talk about later, but something I do want to bring up as I go through my outline and we talk about the notes, is that they actually tested these rubber bands to see how long they would hold their integrity when exposed to the elements, and it appears that they would those rubber bands in that type of situation would only be good for about a year. And this is in 1980. This is 8 years after the original hijacking, right after he jumps out with the money. So it seems very unlikely that the money landed there shortly after the jump. It seems almost more likely that it was placed there within a year of Brian finding it, right? If you look at the facts, but then the money was badly damaged, so the money had disintegrated. Maybe the rubber bands were somehow preserved. I don't know. I didn't dig too much deeper into that because it doesn't ultimately come up with anything too interesting. It is just interesting in itself to note. And while this discovery is much more concrete than the instructions in the hunting cabin, they can tie the serial numbers to the ransom money. In fairness, there was an exploration of the site where the money was found that I'm skipping over a little bit, but again, ultimately, the new information leads to nothing. And as crazy as that sounds, again, kind of given a general overview, that pretty much does it for official evidence of the case, with the exception of a few odd details that we'll probably touch on in the theories. Although before moving on with the theories, there was one last piece of, I'm going to put air quotes on this, evidence. A group of amateur detectives, or amateur sleuths, or true crime enthusiasts, or nerds, or whatever you want to call them, they discovered what appeared to be remnants of a parachute strap and a piece of foam in the Pacific Northwest, roughly lining up with the jump location. But again, we got nothing, right? Nothing but theories and suspects, and this story has no shortage of potential explanations with no definitive answers, which is our favorite kind of thing around here, right? So I want to jump into some of those theories that aim to give closure to this case of DB Cooper. And the first theory is that Cooper did not survive his jump. This is maybe the most obvious conclusion, and it seems to at least unofficially be the position taken by the FBI. Special Agent Larry Carr of the FBI, who took over the investigation in the 2000s, he's quoted as saying, "We originally thought Cooper was an experienced jumper, perhaps even a paratrooper. We concluded after a few years that this was simply not true. No experienced parachutist would have jumped in the pitch-black night in the rain with a 200-mile-an-hour wind in his face, wearing loafers and a trench coat. It was simply too risky. He also missed that his reserve chute was only for training and had been sewn shut, something a skilled skydiver would have checked. Diving into the wilderness without a plan, without the right equipment, in such terrible conditions, he probably never even got his chute open." End quote. Now, it's hard to argue with Special Agent Carr's logic. And if you subscribe to, I believe it's Occam's razor, where the obvious choice is most frequently the correct one, then you most likely have to think that Cooper died before he ever got to the point where he had to worry about the money being traced, right? But if he died, why do we have no body? And why do we have no more money? It also doesn't seem impossible to believe that the FBI was onto something with the belief that Cooper might have been a paratrooper, because of all the experienced skydivers, if any of them are going to be experienced or comfortable jumping at night in less than ideal conditions, you would think it more likely to be military and paratroopers than someone who just skydives for fun on the weekends. And let's be real, you're DB Cooper, right? You get this far into your plan that you are holding parachutes and all of this cash. What option do you have? If you don't jump, there is 100% chance that you're arrested or killed when the plane lands. I mean, I personally am afraid of heights, but in this situation, even I'm jumping, right? You have to. So, yeah, Cooper may have never made it, but that doesn't answer most of our questions, right? And it didn't stop the FBI from investigating suspects. And as if this case didn't seem complicated or confusing enough, in the first 5 years of the investigation, the FBI had considered over 800 suspects. eliminating all but about 24 of them from consideration. And again, that's just the first 5 years. I want to talk about two of the more interesting and, in my opinion, convincing suspects that the FBI mentions, right, or at least talks about, addresses, or with connections to the FBI. The first one, who actually landed on the FBI radar within 1 week of the hijacking, and I, like I said, personally find to be one of the more convincing suspects, official or otherwise, was a man named Sheridan Peterson. Sheridan Peterson was a former Boeing employee who worked in the very same department that wrote the flight manual for the Boeing 727, which was the very same plane from Cooper's hijacking. This is significant to me because the FBI, not only because it is the manual for the same plane, but the FBI obtained samples from that black clip-on tie that was left, again, presumably by Cooper, and they found samples of titanium on that tie. And it's not like titanium is in every office building, right? Titanium is rarely in places where businessmen go, and it was actually fairly rare overall, being used in just a handful of places. But one of those places was at Boeing, who was using that material in manufacturing. So that is a connection to the tie. It's a connection to the knowledge of the plane. Peterson spent a lot of his time in Asia, and he was a Marine. He was in the Marine Corps during World War II. He was known to be an expert skydiver. Ding, ding, another connection. He even spent time as a smoke jumper in Montana, which I had to look up as I was doing my research. A smoke jumper is basically a firefighter who parachutes into hard-to-reach and dangerous areas to fight fires and to conduct rescues and things like that. So that kind of helps paint a picture of the balls this guy must have had, right? So both Cooper and, well, hang on. In 2007, this was one of my favorite things. A 2007 issue of the magazine Smoke Jumper, Peterson was interviewed, and he commented on this suspicion of him being DB Cooper and as saying, quote, "But what was even more incriminating was the photo of me simulating a skydiving maneuver for Boeing's new sheet. I was wearing a suit and tie, the same sort of garb Cooper had worn, right down to the Oxford loafers. It was noted that skydivers don't ordinarily dress so formally." So Peterson, if this all isn't enough to incriminate him, right? Having the picture looking a little, or having a picture working at Boeing, being familiar, an expert skydiver. Again, that was a quote from several people. He also worked at the Issaquah Skydive Center in the early 1960s, and that is the very same skydive school that provided the parachutes for Cooper during the hijacking. Unlike descriptions of Cooper, however, Peterson has blue eyes, not brown. Cooper had chain smoked on the flight, but Peterson is not known to have ever been a smoker. And at the time of the hijacking, Peterson told authorities that he was living with his wife and his family in Nepal, although he offered no definitive proof that he had not traveled back to the United States at the time of the hijacking. Peterson was one of a handful of suspects who was later required, once DNA became more reliable and prevalent, he was one of a handful of suspects required to provide DNA samples. And while it was never confirmed if Peterson was or was not a match, that is an interesting fact in itself, because the FBI directly cleared many others who had been DNA tested, just confirming them as not Cooper, while remaining ultimately silent about Peterson's DNA. And again, it doesn't mean anything. It's just very interesting, and it kind of makes you wonder. The last thing to note about Peterson is an investigator on the case for the History Channel once said that he was, quote, 98% sure that Sheridan Peterson was the skyjacking suspect investigators had been looking for. So Sheridan Peterson, highly likely, one of my favorites. The other interesting and convincing suspect is a man named Robert Rackstraw, and this is a kind of a cooler story that is equally as believable, I would say. Rackstraw was a retired pilot and an ex-convict who served on an Army helicopter in Vietnam. He landed on the FBI radar in February of 1978 when he was arrested in Iran and deported to the United States for explosives as well as fraud. Now, while out on bail for the explosives and fraud charges, Rackstraw attempted to fake his own death, and he was later caught and arrested for forging federal pilot's licenses. So while Cooper investigators noticed a resemblance to the composite sketches, Rackstraw was eliminated as a suspect in 1979 due to the inability to prove any direct connection or involvement until 2016, when a book was released. A book that inspired a History Channel feature, and the popularity of both that feature and the book gave the author, Thomas Colbert, and his attorney, Mark Zaid, the momentum and spark they needed, and they filed a lawsuit to get the FBI to release the D.B. Cooper case file under the Freedom of Information Act. If you remember us talking about the citizen sleuths, aka nerds, from earlier who found the parachute strap and the foam, Colbert was actually the leader of that group who went out searching for evidence. And Thomas Colbert, along with his wife Donna, reported in January of 2018 that they had obtained confession letters originally written in December 1971. If you remember, those 6 letters that we talked about were sent to various newspapers and media. They claimed that the random number strings on these letters were not random. And in fact, they were able to link these numbers to the 3 military units that Rackstraw was a part of during his time in the Army. They view that as a confession. And the week before Colbert was set to turn over all of his evidence to the FBI, the Seattle division of the Bureau canceled their meeting and later officially closed the investigation of the D.B. Cooper case, with the possibility to reopen if anything substantial came to light. And no matter how convincing anything has been to this point, none of it is substantial evidence. We're dealing only in the circumstantial, which selfishly on this show is our favorite place to deal. Now, there are other stranger, but not necessarily less likely or less believable theories that have been thrown at this case. And we can't say that we got down with the strangeness if we don't cover at least a few. One theory is that D.B. Cooper doesn't even exist. Not just a man with a fake name, but a fake man altogether as part of a fake story. It has been theorized that the crew members left on the plane with Cooper were conducting an inside job, and the entire backstory of this hijacker, his amazing jump, was simply an elaborate, creative, and indeed effective misdirect. Cooper communicated through notes and through the flight attendant, Tina Mucklow. The engineer on board, but communicating through Mucklow means that he never had any direct contact with anyone on the ground. He never talked to the FBI on the phone, right? He was constantly relaying it through Mucklow. The engineer, H.E. Anderson, he would conceivably know how to hide money in the best possible place for it to not be discovered, even during an FBI search. Is that far-fetched? Probably. Is it impossible? I don't think so. D.B. Cooper left no fingerprints, despite not wearing any gloves. The DNA has not been linked to anyone. And how hard would it be for an airline staff to fake a ticket and create the only real tangible thing coming in the early days of the investigation, and the thing that sparked the fire of possible distraction? It's more than worth noting that the crew has never, at least publicly, been looked into or investigated. And they've been on the chase for this possible ghost of Dan or D.B. Cooper since day one. And in fairness, there's just as much air quote evidence to connect the crew as there is to connect any of the other suspects. Another strange but weirdly believable and kind of fun theory is that Cooper wasn't just some guy, but he was instead part of the CIA. And this one actually has a fun connection to another theory or solve that we'll get into. We're entering a world of conspiracy a bit here, but if we're being honest, we kind of live there all the time. So this theory, the CIA theory, begins with Air America, which is provably, or was provably, an airline established in 1946, but covertly owned and operated by the CIA from 1950 to 1976. This airline carried out a number of functions, primarily acting as simple personnel and supply transports. But there are a few pieces of this that connect to our story. And one of these operations of Air America did utilize the impressive capabilities of, again, the Boeing 727, the very same aircraft from Cooper's hijacking. They took advantage of the fact that the 727 was able to give the outward appearance of a commercial aircraft, but had the capability to open up and deploy or drop supplies or personnel from that rear door. Does that sound familiar, right? It's not crazy to think that Cooper could have been so calm and comfortable with this jump, with the aircraft, with the conditions, and all of that stuff, because he had done it many times before. And we'll be bringing up our friend and fellow nerd, Colbert, once again for this one. As you know, Thomas Colbert was quick to accuse Rackstraw of being DB Cooper for the reasons that we touched on earlier. There was a little more. Colbert claims that based on interviews and research that he conducted on Rackstraw, Rackstraw had done, quote, off-the-books CIA work in some capacity in the past. And Rackstraw was a pilot during Vietnam, which Air America was active under the CIA banner during and directly influential or involved in Vietnam. So were authorities onto something with Rackstraw? Maybe they dismissed him as a suspect due to pressure or interference from the CIA from wanting this all to go public, right? That one is almost a 2-for-1 because you go with CIA operative and Rackstraw, right? It's also equally as likely that Rackstraw did it without the CIA, or that Rackstraw was never involved, but the person that did it was a CIA operative. And then beyond that, if it was a CIA person familiar with this Air America operation, where are they stealing the money for their own selfish personal purposes? Or could we have never found this money in circulation because it was spent in other countries or laundered by our own government? Perhaps the person was retrieving this money on behalf of the CIA, and the money was going to be used for some kind of deep cover operation that are, again, quote, off the books, as we said before. If I keep going too much further with those questions and going into that, I'll be wearing a tinfoil hat before this episode is over. So let's move on from the CIA. The last interesting thing I want to discuss is less of a theory that points to a person or even tries to give closure, but it's more a theory that just adds to the profile of who we may want to look at when we look at suspects. This theory is much stronger than this next sentence will make it sound, but this theory comes from a comic book, Les Aventures de Dan Cooper. I hope I said that correctly. This was a French comic conceived in 1954 about a fictional Canadian military flying, military pilot, ace pilot, a rocket ship pilot. The main character, Dan Cooper, he's a test pilot in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and his adventures have him doing all kinds of aerial feats, such as skydiving from a plane, as well as other parallels to the events of this very hijacking, such as demanding money in a knapsack. And while this probably is not some fictional character come to life, and I highly doubt that any cosplayer would take it this far, it does paint a different picture, or at least add a little more detail and mystery to the identity of DB Cooper, because that comic was not translated or distributed in America. So it's likely that Cooper spent time overseas, or quite possibly was foreign himself. Even though accounts of Cooper say he had no obvious accent, he did specify he wanted negotiable American currency, which is not how I imagine any American would say that. And he was also very polite, which also seems un-American, and a little more Canadian, as Canadians are polite and quite possibly could speak French. So, just an interesting connection to that comic book, a lot of parallels with the character. And here we are in 2021, no money turning up in circulation, no body found splattered on the ground, no DNA matches, no valid confessions, and no answers. Over 1,000 suspects, countless personal claims, and seemingly infinite conspiracies. We covered most of the good ones here, but there's definitely more that you can lose yourself in on this case if you feel so inclined. But this is the only unsolved piracy case in commercial aviation history This is the story of DB Cooper, and this is the end of our episode. DB Cooper likely never to be solved, but that's honestly the kind of stuff that we like around here. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for getting down with the strangeness. Remember to leave a rating and review on Apple or even Spotify. I think now has ratings, maybe not. But ratings and reviews just help exponentially, and it means the world to me. If you're someone who listens or watches on YouTube, you can subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, all that cool YouTube stuff. Hopefully you enjoy being able to see some of the visuals as we discuss the different topics and things like that. Follow the social medias for more strangeness, right? We're on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. Join the Strange Squad email list. Send me an email directly, downwiththestrangeness@gmail.com. Links for the Instagram, Patreon, email list, and everything else are available in the show notes. I will be back next week. I can't wait to do this with you guys again. And until then, stay strange.